Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for yet again another in our continuing series of Speak Up for Justice. I'm joined with my co-host for the first time. Former journalist Kathy Fowler is going to help us through this process. Hey, Kathy.
Hello, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for doing it with us. So, look, the topic of today's program is undermining justice. Former U.S. attorneys expose the threats to America. There are moments in history where silence is not an option. And this, folks, is one of them. Today, we have the honor of hearing from four former U.S. attorneys who have dedicated their lives to upholding justice, and they'll discuss the critical dangers eroding our democracy today and why the fight to preserve it belongs to each of us. Today, we're going to be joined by four remarkable guests. The first, of course, needs no introduction, but Governor Christie. I will introduce you, Governor Christie, as well. Governor Christie, former U.S. attorney, you may not have known, from the District of New Jersey, my home state, and appointed by President George W. Bush, and later elected governor of the state of New Jersey. Preet Bharara is a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and he was appointed by Barack Obama to that position. And we've got Liz Oyer, and Liz Oyer is a former U.S. pardon attorney, and she was appointed by Joseph Biden. And look, I want to take a second out to say this. In the past, I have not identified any of our judicial officers or others who've been appointed by different presidents. And that's because this is a nonpartisan group. But what's important here is that you recognize that the messaging that's happening in this program, and today in particular, is a call out from both sides. Recognize that there are risks to our judicial system, risks to the rule of law, that all of us, regardless of our political positions or views, need to come together and find a way to seek common ground for the sake of the rule of law and the country that we live in. And so I'm thrilled that we're going to have a chance to speak to all of you about some of the dangers that have come up only in the last month since we've done this last. The first thing I want to do is play a clip from Todd Blanche, and he is the second in command of the Justice Department. And here are some comments he made just last month. Let's play the clip.
There's a group of judges that are repeat players, and that's obviously not by happenstance. That's intentional. And it's a war, man. The system is not set up for efficiency when it comes to rogue activist judges. So we lose days, we lose weeks, months sometimes because of this. And that's why activist groups do what they do. If there's young lawyers out there that want to have a great time going to court, you're going to lose a lot. But going to court and just fighting, you should come work at the Department of Justice. And we need you. There has got to be a couple dozen young lawyers who are thirsty and hungry and ready to work because we need you, because it is a war, and it is something that we will not win unless we keep on fighting. And we are not wrong. And I've said that a couple times, and it's true, and it's evidenced by the results we're seeing at the Supreme Court and at the Courts of Appeals. What a travesty it is when you have an individual judge be able to stop an entire operation or an entire administrative policy that's constitutional and allowed just because he or she chooses to do so.
So you may want to play that clip privately again and again and again to hear the fact that the second in command in the Justice Department is essentially saying that we are at war with activist judges. And those activist judges cross along all political levels, whether they're appointed by a Democrat or a Republican. If they do not agree with the administration, they are viewed as rogue judges. And it just doesn't stop with the judges. It includes individuals who work within the office itself. And that's why we have the opportunity to speak with four Justice Department lawyers, U.S. attorneys who were there not to fulfill the role of what the president wanted them to do, but to do their job is following the rule of law and the constitutional requirements that are imposed on them. So we have Liz Oyer, and Liz, give us a second tell us who you were.
Sure. So I worked at the Justice Department as the pardon attorney. My job was to advise the president about the use of the executive clemency power. I was actually not a political appointee. I was a career professional in the Justice Department, and my job was to ensure that the clemency process was not thoroughly politicized by making neutral, nonpartisan recommendations based on merit and a consistent set of principles to the president as he considered the use of his executive clemency authority.
So what happened in your career when you attempted, tell us what happened when you did not agree with the administration on what they wanted you to do with regard to a pardon.
Sure. So early in the Trump administration, I continued to serve in my role, which was non-political, but the workflow in my office changed. We were asked to work on a new project related to restoring federal firearm rights, and my office was asked to identify candidates who could safely receive their gun rights back from the Attorney General. The Attorney General has the statutory authority to grant people reinstatement of their Second Amendment rights after they've lost it due to a criminal conviction. I was asked to come up with a list of candidates who could receive this type of relief, and then I was asked to add a friend of the president, the actor Mel Gibson, to the list of people I was recommending receive reinstatement of their gun rights. The actor Mel Gibson lost his right to own a firearm because he was convicted of a domestic assault against his former girlfriend and a very serious incident. It's very dangerous for people who have domestic abuse history to be in possession of firearms. So I was unable to make that recommendation that the Attorney General reinstate Mel Gibson's gun rights. And after much back and forth with senior officials in the department, I clearly communicated that I could not make that recommendation. And within several hours, I was fired from my role as pardon attorney.
And so let's talk just briefly about your termination as pardon attorney. Were you paid a visit by any armed individuals to discuss your decision?
Well, after I was fired, I was asked to testify about the circumstances of my firing before members of Congress, which I agreed to do. For me, this is an issue of great public concern, the firing of non-political career experts in the Justice Department who are using their knowledge and expertise to inform policy decisions by the leadership of the department. When I made known that I was going to testify, I received a call late on a Friday night, the Friday night before the Monday I was supposed to testify, from an individual in the Department of Justice who was essentially doing me a favor, who was calling to give me a heads up that there were two armed special deputy U.S. Marshals on their way to my home to deliver me essentially a warning letter about my testimony before members of Congress. This person was just calling because they were very disturbed that this was happening. It was at 9 o'clock at night when I got this notice. The armed officers were scheduled to arrive at my house sometime around 10 o'clock that evening. My teenager was home alone. And on learning this, I really just panicked. I became aware of how vindictive and retaliatory the current leadership of the Justice Department is. And fortunately, due to the grace of this person who called me, I was able to make arrangements to get those individuals called off before they arrived at my home. And I did eventually receive the letter sent to me by email, which was a warning about all the risks that I would be taking if I went forward and testified before Congress. That just made me more determined than ever to go ahead with the testimony. I don't like to be bullied. I was not going to be silenced by bullies. So I went ahead and testified because I believe that it is important to expose the corruption and abusive process that's taking place within the Justice Department now and not to be complicit in it.
Well, look, and thank you so much for that, of course.
We'll go to Preet Bharara. You served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York through a normal Democratic to Republican transition. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience during that period and how it compares to what we're seeing today? And keep in mind the tape that we had just heard earlier from Todd Blanche. What is the difference now?
Well, it's good to be here. It's good to be with other people who care about these issues. Thank you for speaking up about them. And thank you for convening this group. Well, the circumstances of my departure were a little bit unusual. I had been asked by President Trump during the transition to stay on as U.S. Attorney, and then at some point later, in an incident that seems sort of quaint, several weeks into my tenure, I refused to return a call from the sitting President of the United States because I didn't know what the call was about. And based on department guidelines and my own sense of ethics and responsibility, I didn't think it was appropriate for a sitting United States attorney with jurisdiction over lots of things relating to the sitting president to have a conversation with him outside of the normal channels, without the attorney general, without the deputy attorney general, unless I knew what the matter was about. And the next day, or I guess 48 hours later, I was gone. One difference between how justice was administered in the prior administration versus the two Trump administrations is the involvement of the sitting president of the United States in matters of criminal law enforcement. There is nothing wrong with, and indeed there should be, some amount of attention paid by a sitting president to priorities of the Justice Department, to health, public safety, whether it's narcotics trafficking or human trafficking or public corruption or corruption on Wall Street. Those kinds of things, what the priorities should be, how they should be set, what resources are available and should be brought to bear, are all perfectly appropriate things for a sitting commander-in-chief president of the United States to be thinking about and messaging to his or her attorney general about. What is not appropriate and bordering on, I guess I'll say an obstruction of the separation of powers, among other things, is directives aimed at particular individuals, either to lay off them or to prosecute them. And we have seen now in multiple cases that judges have adjudicated with respect to U.S. attorneys appointed inappropriately, in cases brought inappropriately, and motions that have been made, some of which we haven't seen resolved yet, on vindictive prosecution and selective prosecution grounds, a sitting president of the United States directing not just the attorney general, the deputy attorney general, but particular field office U.S. attorneys to pursue political enemies, even when it's the case that prior selected U.S. attorneys have declined to pursue those cases, have found them not to be in the interest of justice, have found there not to be sufficient evidence. And so that's a different thing. And I think others will have something to say about it. I think that's a problem, and that should worry every American.
Well, there's no doubt about that. And that's why, of course, we're gathering here to have this conversation, because really now is the time for all of us as a nation to come together and have our voices heard before it is too late. Governor Christie, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Fabulous. So having heard the Deputy Attorney General Blanche call for a fight and a war on the judiciary, hearing what happened to Liz Oyer, is this what your experience was like when you were the U.S. Attorney?
It was not in the Bush 43 administration. It was made very clear to us from the beginning what the president's priorities were, kind of in the way that Preet just laid it out in terms of where resources should be expended, where he would ask Congress to give us additional resources, especially in the aftermath of September 11th. We got a lot of additional resources regarding fighting the war against terrorism. And so those things are, I agree with Preet, perfectly appropriate, and I think, quite frankly, necessary for a president to do, is to set those priorities and to instruct his attorney general on where he wants those resources to be spent. But I will tell you that after that, I really didn't hear much from the Department of Justice on a day-to-day basis regarding the work that I was doing. I was told to conduct myself in an ethical way, that at all times pursued the cause of justice as we saw it in our district, and that if they thought I was doing something that was inappropriate or contrary to the administration's priorities, that I'd hear from them. I didn't hear from them during my 7 years in that department in any of those ways. And I do think that the real problem here is that you have a president of the United States now who is directing the Justice Department on who should be and who should not be prosecuted. Now, he can use, as Liz knows all too well, he can use his very broad pardon authority to critique the work that's done by his own Justice Department and previous Justice Departments. And that's a perfectly appropriate constitutional exercise. But he shouldn't be telling people who to do that. Now, I do disagree with Preet. I don't think it's a separation of powers issue. because the Justice Department is within the executive branch. But what I think it is politicizing the law enforcement work. And once you begin to do that, then the Justice Department just becomes another arm of the White House in terms of punishing enemies or giving a break to friends. That's not what the American justice system has been based on from the beginning. And so, from that perspective, it's disturbing. And you've seen it, by the way, most recently been rejected by grand juries twice now in the Eastern District of Virginia, who have rejected the calls for an indictment of the New York Attorney General Letitia James. I could tell you in my 7 years, we never got what's called no billed or rejected by a grand jury when we brought a case before them. And there's two reasons why. One, we tried to be very, very careful about the things we brought before the grand jury, and that we would have evidence not just to meet the standard of an indictment, but already had evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to prove someone's guilt. And secondly, so that people understand the process of a grand jury, if they're listening and haven't experienced it, there's no one in there to argue against you. The government and the FBI or whatever the appropriate law enforcement agency that worked on the case, we are in there by ourselves with nobody representing the people that we are choosing to present the indictment against.
So in other words, Governor, it's a one-sided presentation to a group of individuals, citizens, to decide whether or not someone should be indicted or not. But there's no defense. It's just you're presenting it to a grand jury.
Exactly. And as you know, for those baseball fans out there, it's not hitting a pitch from a pitcher. It is putting the ball on the tee and swinging and missing. And it never happened in my 7 years. We never got a no bill. And I think it speaks volumes towards people's concern, regular citizens, which is who makes up the grand jury. People just get a subpoena, they come in and they become members of a grand jury. And what they're confronted with, I think, is not only you've got to conclude the weakness of the evidence in the Letitia James case, but I can't help but believe that they're also disturbed by the fact that they see this as a retaliatory use of our justice system. And that's something that everybody in the country should be concerned about.
Yeah, no doubt. In just a minute, we're going to do a little history lesson of how the president appoints U.S. attorneys and the process it goes through all the way down to the grand jury. So we're going to have a little chart in a minute to give people a sense of how that works.
Why should everyday Americans and citizens be concerned about this? If we bring it back to home, people who don't follow the DOJ, don't follow our legal system as closely as everybody here. How does this impact them?
Look, I think that, the reason to be concerned is to start by looking at the seal of the department. The seal of the department does not say Department of Prosecution. It says Department of Justice. And I think what people have come to expect over the last 2.5 centuries is that the Department of Justice would do their very best to make sure that justice was done. I used to tell my assistant U.S. attorneys all the time that that's your task, is to make sure justice is done. And no matter what happens, if we believe justice is done, then we win. And that's what keeps ourselves a civilized and lawful society, is that when there are people who break the laws, when there are people who commit violent acts, when there are people who steal and cheat from other citizens, well, then we have a Justice Department that will, without fear or favor, go after those folks to make sure that justice is done. And so what you should be concerned about is that won't be being done across the country. And one of the reasons is we've seen these, large numbers of resignations from U.S. attorneys' offices and from Main Justice, the department in D.C., over the course of the last 10 months. And, you saw that the Deputy Attorney General there made a very direct commercial to lawyers, to young lawyers, to come and work at the Justice Department because they need the help. Well, they need the help in large measure because so many people have left in a act of protest against either what they were directly asked to do or what they've seen their colleagues be asked to do. A diminution of the number of prosecutors across the 93 districts in the country should also concern people, because that means that crime is going unabated, crime is going without being prosecuted, and people who commit crimes are not going to jail. And those are all things that people should be concerned about.
So let's talk a second about how we go through the process of appointing U.S. attorneys. And we have a graphic that kind of shows the process we go through in this country. So it starts with the U.S. Attorney's Office, Justice Department is a part of the executive branch. So it is, in fact, the president who appoints individuals who would be considered for U.S. attorneys. It starts actually with the Attorney General. So the Attorney General is selected by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and then the president proposes U.S. attorneys. They are the heads of their offices in the districts that they're living in, and there are 93 U.S. attorneys across the country. Each U.S. attorney is nominated by the president, but ultimately confirmed by the Senate. And I want to stop there for just a second, because it's important we take a pause here to talk about what that means, the nomination versus the confirmation. So Preet, can you talk us a little bit about how that works in terms of nomination and then confirmation?
Sure. It's a shared responsibility for certain officers of the United States. So whereas the president of the United States of any party at any time has his or her choice of national security advisor or staffer or chief of staff or communications director, carte blanche, that is not so for other offices designated by either the Constitution or statute. He can have his Secretary of Labor, he can have a Secretary of War or Defense, but that person needs to be confirmed by the United States Senate. This is what I was talking about before when I mentioned separation of powers issues. United States attorneys are deemed such officers so that the president gets his choice in the first instance. But if the Senate doesn't, through advice and consent, confirm that person is not supposed to serve. So one of the things happening in this administration is an end run around the Senate's role, another co-equal branch of government's role, in who should or should not serve as United States attorney by manipulating the Vacancies Reform Act and a lot of other things. They've done that in New Jersey and elsewhere.
So let's just look at that for 1 second, Preet. Sorry to interrupt. So basically, let's look at Alina Habba. So Alina Habba is proposed to be the U.S. attorney for New Jersey. And ultimately, her interim appointment expires because the Senate does not confirm her. And when that happens, right, the judges have the opportunity, if they want to vote, to have that individual continue to serve as the U.S. attorney. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's basically correct. I mean, there's a lot of sausage that got made in connection with how the vacancies work and what the periods of time are, and whether it's interim or acting or whatever. The bottom line takeaway should be that certain jobs are supposed to be filled by people who have been approved by the United States Senate. And obviously there are vacancies from time to time. People leave office, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not. But it is not supposed to be the case that through a process of evasion of the statute or serial interim appointments, that you get around the Senate role. And for years and years and years, you have someone that the president himself has decided in his own discretion should have that role. That doesn't work for Secretary of State, although that's a different situation. It has a different set of statutes applying to it. But it most certainly does not work with respect to United States attorneys. And that's what is partly the thing that's at stake here as well. It's a two-branch process. And as you point out, a three-branch process when the court gets involved.
When she was not confirmed by the judges, then is it fair to say that you're supposed to say thank you and then clear out of your office?
Yes.
Okay. And did that happen in New Jersey? Did she thank you and clear out?
I believe the reporting is she has cleared out after the fact.
I think it went to the Third Circuit. It went to the Court of Appeal.
Yes. Yeah. So she waited for a court ruling. The courts with whom we are ostensibly at war, per the Deputy Attorney General, but with a message, as I understand it, from the senior executives of the Justice Department that they want her back, and we'll see what happens there.
And I guess the question would be this, right? The Third Circuit said thank you, but no, and it seems that Ms. Habba did vacate the office for the moment. I don't think it's ever gotten to this. I've never heard of a Supreme Court ruling on this sort of. Has there ever been a time where the Supreme Court's been asked to rule on an issue like this you're aware of?
I am not. They've been busy dealing with people who have been fired from the Federal Trade Commission in the last couple of weeks.
So, so let's put the graphic back up there so we just give the folks watching this a sense. So ultimately, in addition to the 93 U.S. attorneys, there are career prosecutors, career assistant U.S. attorneys. They're known as AUSAs, and they're very, very important to the functioning of our judicial system. And they are career lifers. They're not political appointees. They're selected by merit, and they can stay hopefully for as long as they choose to stay. It's those career AUSAs who traditionally present the issues for potential indictment to the grand jury. And as the governor indicated, those are just citizens called together to listen to the evidence presented by the assistant U.S. attorney. Rarely will a U.S. attorney, him or herself, present something to a grand jury. It'll be more likely an AUSA who does, but it still requires an indictment happen. If the grand jury does not indict the individual, then there's no crime that's going to be charged to that person in a federal system. And so that's where the citizens play a role. And what, of course, happened with Letitia James and what happened with James Comey is a bit of an end round with that. But that's the way the process plays out. And it's a dynamic approach. And now let's talk about what's happened to our career prosecutors. There's been a huge outflow of individuals who were selected as assistant U.S. attorneys. And Governor, perhaps you can address what's happened in the Justice Department with regard to the resignation of thousands of line AUSAs.
Sure. I mean, look, I'll just use the example of my old district in New Jersey. We have approximately 150 AUSAs in that office, and a third of them have resigned since the appointment of Alina Habba. And so, you have a situation where in any office, if a third of the AUSAs were to go, it is going to have an enormous impact upon your ability to bring cases and prosecute cases that have already been indicted, because each one of those AUSAs has a list of cases that they're working on that they've brought. When they leave, those have to be assigned to someone else. And so, those cases are being assigned to a smaller and smaller group of people. And so the effect on the justice system is extraordinary when that many people leave. And, as I said earlier, I think from what I've heard from conversations with people who have left, and also with conversations with people who are still at the Justice Department, what they're being confronted with is a situation where they're being asked to do things that they believe are either unethical or not appropriate pursuit of justice, like in the James case where AUSA said there was no evidence there to support an indictment, yet the U.S. attorney was insisting that the indictment be presented to the grand jury anyway. Well, those AUSAs have a choice. They either can do something they believe is contrary to the oath they took, or they can quit. And we've seen in my old district, about a third of the AUSAs make the decision to leave. And that's, I think, happening in every office across the country, and certainly at Main Justice as well. And that is a real problem for our system to work efficiently, effectively, and fairly if you don't have enough people to be able to deal with the crime that's being committed in your particular district.
Okay, and literally just yesterday, Liz, the LA Times did their own internal investigation and found that 9 Department of Justice AUSAs resigned when they were asked by the DOJ, Maine DOJ, to investigate UC campuses for anti-Semitism. And they felt that they were being asked to do what they felt was not an ethically appropriate investigation. And 9 DOJ officers resigned. Is that unusual in your mind, Liz?
Well, Paul, I think to put all of this in context, it's important for folks who aren't familiar with the ins and outs of the Justice Department to understand that the work of the Justice Department typically changes very little from one president to the next. There are political appointees that the president gets to appoint, but the overwhelming majority of the workforce is career professionals who serve under any president of any party. Their work continues seamlessly from one administration to the next for the most part. The changes that we see in the Justice Department with the appointment of new U.S. attorneys, they're really pretty marginal. And within the spectrum of U.S. attorneys, they're really not that different. The ones that are appointed by Republican presidents and by Democratic presidents usually are highly qualified and experienced lawyers who have past experience working for the Justice Department. They know the ins and outs of federal court and how to litigate these important matters on behalf of the United States. And so there really isn't that much change normally. What we've seen now is quite extraordinary because this president is trying to remake the Justice Department wholesale very quickly in this administration. And part of that has involved putting people into positions based on political loyalty alone, often people who lack the ordinary basic prerequisite qualifications. You spoke about Alina Habba. What's so striking about her isn't only how she was appointed, but the fact that she had no experience prior to becoming U.S. attorney, even litigating criminal cases. She had never handled a criminal case before. She'd never worked in the Justice Department. She is one of many U.S. attorneys appointed by Donald Trump or that Trump has tried to install who really have no relevant experience. They're being put into their positions because they will carry out the president's marching orders without question. That is extremely unusual. That is unprecedented. It really does not happen in ordinary times. And it's very dangerous because we need people who are qualified, competent experts in these important positions of leadership. We do not need people who are blindly following orders. We need people who can tell the president what, based on their expert judgment, he should be doing, not taking commands from the top down. And essentially, that's the situation that we now have in the Justice Department, which was why we are seeing career professionals quit in unprecedented numbers. They are being put in positions on a daily basis where they are being asked to compromise their ethical duties, their professional obligations in service of the political agenda of the president. And that is something that any lawyer who wants to preserve their bar license and uphold their duty to the Constitution knows that they cannot do.
But let me ask you, Preet. Look, if I'm appointed by Donald Trump to be a U.S. attorney, isn't it my job to fulfill my duty to the president who appointed me? Isn't that what I'm supposed to do?
No, thanks for the softball question. Your duty is to the law, to the Constitution. That's to whom you swear an oath. You don't swear an oath to any particular person, much less the president of the United States. I don't have a long answer to that other than to say that's not how it works. That's not how you would want it to work. And by the way, as Governor Christie and others have pointed out, career prosecutors, generally speaking, span multiple administrations and presidents who were elected by both parties. I started as an assistant U.S. attorney 26 years ago under President Bush, and continued into subsequent administrations. The people that you're talking to on this panel, Governor Christie and I and others, who are political appointees, the only person in any U.S. attorney's office who's a political appointee is the United States attorney. Everyone on down, including the criminal division chief, the first assistant, the supervisors, the line assistants, are all career prosecutors hired for the duration. And some of them will stay for 3 years, which is the minimum requirement. And some of them will stay for decades, serving under presidents of both parties. And that's how it should be, because the oath is to do your job without fear or favor, not with deference to a particular person, certainly not the president of the United States.
So let's talk about the risks of not doing what is the favor of the president who wants you to engage in certain acts. We have a couple of videos I think are worth watching for a moment for us to get a perspective on what happens when you cross the line on this one. So let's play the video of Marjorie Taylor Greene when she was in full form as a congresswoman. If you could play that for us, Dylan.
Lincoln Lincoln Riley.
Tell us about Jewish space.
No, why don't you go talk about Jewish space lasers? And really, why don't you off? How about that?
I think your fake eyelashes are messing up.
No, ain't nothing.
Hold on.
Video.
Should the defense secretary and the vice
Wait, what country are you
from the UK?
Okay, we don't give a crap about your opinion and your reporting. Why don't you go back to your country? It's the most toxic political culture, and it's not helping the American
But you
people.
contributed to that. You were out there pounding, insulting people.
Leslie, you've contributed to it as well with your
Me?
own program. Yes, you're accusatory, just like you did just then.
I haven't heard you speak out about it until it was directed at you.
Dana, I think that's fair criticism, and I would like to say humbly, I'm sorry for taking part in the toxic politics. It's very bad for our country. So look, the fact is, when we have these kinds of conversations where we're challenging whether it's the rightfulness of an individual to stay as a U.S. attorney, or we're issuing pardons for individuals that people don't believe ought to be pardoned. That's why we have a jury system. That's why we have convictions. In fact, you might know this fact, Liz. How do you recall how many pardons were issued over 32 years between 5 presidents? Do you have an estimate of what that number is for those 32 years?
Wow, I have not put together that math.
We did. Kathy, what's the math on that? Over 32 years, 5 presidents, it's how many?
We had
There it is.
625 pardons. If you look from the presidents Bush, Obama, Trump's first term, and then Biden. So over 32 years, there were only 625 pardons. Compare that to the first 10 months of the second term of Trump. It's 1,500 plus pardons. How unusual is that? And is this obviously a problem? Is this an abuse of the pardon system?
The problem that we're seeing now with the pardon power is that it is being exercised at the discretion of the president without any governing rules or principles and without any systematic vetting of the candidates who are receiving pardons. My job in the Justice Department was to review applications for presidential pardons and to oversee the vetting of those individuals to ensure that recommendations were made to the president based on merit. In the ordinary course of things, all stakeholders in the justice system have the opportunity to weigh in on whether the president should grant a pardon before a decision is made. So, as pardon attorney, if we were considering recommending a pardon, we would refer the case to the FBI for a background investigation of the individual to make sure they really were worthy. We would refer the case to the U.S. attorney to give them the opportunity to weigh in on whether the individual was a suitable candidate. We would reach out to the judge who sentenced the person and solicit their views. And we would reach out to any victims of the crime to give them the opportunity to be heard in the decision-making process. So the process is intended to be one that makes the justice system fairer by applying a consistent set of standards, applying rigorous vetting, and seeking the input of all stakeholders before a decision is made. This president is bypassing that process completely, has completely sidelined the non-political career professionals in the Justice Department, and is making decisions that appear to be based on political loyalty and financial interests and personal interests. They are not based on the merits of the application, which is very destructive and detrimental to the justice system. This president has actually undercut several long-term ongoing prosecutions being pursued by his own Justice Department through the use of pardons without consulting the career prosecutors and investigators who have spent years working on and building these cases, and without consulting the victims who in many cases are severely harmed and re-traumatized by the decision to grant a pardon.
So, Governor Christie, you obviously work directly with the clemency process as governor. When you see what's happening today, do you think does this have an impact on public trust in the justice system? How does this affect Americans?
Yeah, look, it certainly does. And I would say in response to what Liz said, like, look, the pardon power is constitutionally vested in the executive. In the federal branch, it's the president. and obviously in the state, in the states, it's the governor. And so I don't have any objection to a president deciding who he or she, and a governor as well, wants to pardon. Ultimately, that's what the people, you're the person that people have elected, and they've delegated that responsibility to you through the Constitution. The problem here is that there seems to be absolutely no rhyme or reason for it. I saw one that I was particularly puzzled by and disturbed by, when the president was asked a question recently about pardoning the former president of Honduras, who had been convicted and sentenced, I think, to 45 years in jail for drug trafficking. And when he was asked about it, he said, I really don't know him. I don't know much about him. I don't know much about the case. Well, that's a problem. Because if you're the person who's going to put your signature on a pardon, wiping away the criminal record of someone who was convicted by a jury of having engaged in a volume of drug trafficking that got him 45 years in prison. When I was making decisions regarding clemency, whether it was a pardon or a commutation, I made sure that I knew everything about what had brought that person to this point, both their criminal conduct on the particular charge, any other criminal conduct they might have been involved in over the course of their life, how they served in prison, and any steps they had taken towards rehabilitation, and apologizing for the crimes and taking responsibility for the crimes that they may have committed. And so, for him to give that kind of answer tells you why people would have a concern about it. It's not just who is getting clemency, or how many are getting clemency. It is, what is the quality of the decision-making process? Does the president really know what he's doing? Does any governor know exactly what they're doing? And without having a process like Liz spoke about, where you have lawyers who are looking at this for you, giving you the complete record to review, giving you their opinion, granting that it's only their opinion. In the end, the governor or the president gets to make those decisions, but those opinions are important for the governor or the president to consider in making these judgments. And we don't see evidence that that's what's going on. Seems like whoever can get their way into the Oval Office right now and whisper in the president's ear about a friend or client of theirs is someone who's being openly considered for a pardon, and that undercuts people's confidence in the process.
And I'm going to describe that as an understatement. In fact, what's happening right now in America is undercutting the rule of law, the constitutional framework, the guardrails that we have as a country. We began this program back in April with Erwin Chemerinsky and some brilliant speakers to talk about the risks to lawyers who are being asked to bend a knee to the administration or face significant economic hardship. Perkins Coie took them on, others did not. That's how we started. Then we moved on to judges and the criticism of judges, which is ongoing, and the risk to judicial officers from Esther Salas on down, the risk to judges and doing their job and the criticism they're being hit with, even to this very day. There are quotes in the paper from Pam Bondi and others that are criticizing what judges are doing. And that imposes great risk on the judges and on their families. And no one is really getting out there and speaking up about those risks. Let's play another tape from MTG when she realized the risks that happen when you criticize. Let's play that tape.
I've watched stupid people like Marjorie Trader Green, or some people call her Taylor Green, some people call her Taylor Brown, because green sometimes turns to brown, which isn't nice. But I've watched her say that he spends too much time on foreign. I only have one place in mind, it's the United States.
I feel very sorry for President Trump. I genuinely do. It has to be a hard place for someone that is constantly so hateful, and puts so much vitriol, name calling, and really tells lies about people in order to try to get his way or win some kind of fight. As a Christian, I'm not angry at the president. It's easy for me to say a prayer for him and forgive him. But the part that I have had a very hard time with is the fact that he called me a traitor. And because of his words, that brought serious threats against myself and my family. We had a pipe bomb threat on my home, a pipe bomb threat on my family construction company and staff, and had multiple pizza doxings. But the serious one was the direct death threats on my son. And I think that goes beyond anyone's arguments or disagreements or politics. All of our children and our families' safety should matter to anyone, no matter if they're mad at us or disagree with us. I think that should be something we respect.
So let's make this concrete. Let's bring this down to basic citizens levels. If the justice system becomes politicized in the way that we see might be happening, how does that affect citizens? How does that affect people? Liz?
That's a great question. I think that these issues can sometimes seem distant and removed from people's lives, but what is happening at the Justice Department is critically important to all of us. The core mission of the Justice Department, which I'm not sure that all Americans understand, is to keep us safe, to uphold our civil rights, to protect our civil rights, and to uphold the rule of law in our country. And those are core important issues for all Americans. Since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Justice Department has worked hard to proactively prevent national security incidents like that, to prevent us from things like terrorism, to prevent cyber attacks, things that could cripple this entire country. And we need the experienced career professionals who are advising the leadership of the department and the president based on their deep knowledge and expertise to be in the building to protect us all, to keep us all safe. Those people have been rooted out. The Attorney General has literally said expressly that she is rooting out career professionals who are not going to get with the loyalty program and firing them. We need those people in the building to keep us all safe. The safety of our country and every individual in our country depends on it. And my deep fear is that it will take some truly catastrophic event happening in our country before we can all feel the full depth and breadth of the negative impact that this politicization of justice has had on our country.
So let's put a question to everybody on the panel here. If there is a breakdown in the trust between U.S. attorneys and the courts, will that lead to a breakdown of the justice system and the rule of law? And quickly, like on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most concerned, how concerned are you about the threats to democracy right now? Governor Christie, can we start with you?
Sure. Look, the thing that has always distinguished our democratic republic from others in history has been our independent judiciary, has been the idea that the executive branch and the legislative branch have willingly given up authority to the judicial branch to review and pass judgment on the constitutionality and legality of their actions on behalf of the people. And that's what's always distinguished us from everyone else. And so when you have a situation where that judicial branch is not operating in a way where there's trust and respect between them and the executive branch, that's a real problem. And it is a threat to people believing in the fact that when they go into a federal or state courtroom in this country, but today we're focusing on federal, when they go into a federal courtroom in this country, that they're going to be treated with fairness, that justice is going to be the goal. And that undercuts a large part of our democratic republic. And so, that is a real problem that, we need to deal with as a country directly. And we haven't been. Everyone has their moments where they disagree with the decision that's been made in a court, either by a jury, by a judge, or by both. But it's different to say that I disagree, you have an opportunity to appeal and all the rest, and to say that there's a war going on. between the executive branch and the judicial branch. That also undercuts people's confidence in the fact that our justice system is different and better. It's been said in history that it may not be the best system that's ever been devised, but it's better than all the other ones that have been tried. And I think that we need to have more respect for that. And everyone in the system has to display that respect. And right now, that's not being done.
So would that mean you're very concerned? Would you give it a?
No, I look. This conversation about very concerned about our democracy. No, I'm not. I am not very concerned about our democracy. I am concerned about the strength of our institutions and how some of those institutions, like the Justice Department, are being degraded. But no, I am not one of these people who say that our democracy is. I'm very concerned about its future existence. I believe the American people will, when necessary, stand up for the things that we have fought for 250 years, and my confidence is in the American people. I've been very direct about my criticisms today about what I think needs to be done differently, but it doesn't extend to me saying, "Oh, I think our democracy is at risk." No, I don't think our democracy is at very grave risk. What I do think, though, is that we are weakening it for the future, and that every time you do that, you place the next generation at a place that's much worse than it was left for us, and that's a failure of our generation if we permit it to happen.
Preet,
So
same question.
I'm glad to hear that you're not concerned about the democracy, because I have more fear in it than perhaps you do, which is okay. Preet, what's your fear level?
Hi.
That's not a softball. That's a tough question.
I don't know if it's that tough in these circumstances. Look, if the question is democracy going to fall, and will we have classic monarchy or despotism in the next 2 years? No, I don't believe that. So I agree with Governor Christie in that regard. If the question is, do you have deep and abiding concerns based on the track record and the trajectory that we're on, that fundamental principles, including institutions, which Governor Christie mentioned, the fundamental principles of our system will be degraded and will take a long time to build back up again, then yeah, I'm deeply, deeply concerned. What we have not had happen yet is a good old-fashioned, straight, head-on constitutional crisis in which the administration literally, flatly, and in a conspicuous public way, on a meaningful public issue, refuses an order of the court. We've gotten close to that on a couple of occasions. I think part of the reason for people being sanguine about the future of democracy is that has not happened. We have proceedings that are unfolding right now in one or more courts around the country where there are queries being made by district court judges to find out why earlier orders were not complied with, why people were deported when they shouldn't have been. And I think everyone should wait and see with a clear head and open eyes as to how those things play out. Because we're only in year one of this trajectory. And if in year two you have open defiance of district court judges and appellate court judges, and ultimately perhaps the Supreme Court, even though it's stacked heavily in favor of this administration's ideology, then you have a serious degradation of democracy, and the threat level is incredibly high. And the reason to have concern about that is not only the policies that are being engaged in, but the rhetoric that Governor Christie and others have mentioned. When you have sitting senators who are educated and have gone to law school, and fine and selective law schools at that, who complain about a district court opinion and call an opinion that's at its earliest stage in the judicial process, as they well know, a judicial insurrection or judicial coup, or you have the Deputy Attorney General saying we're at war, man, to make it more colloquial. That's a real problem. The solution to all those things is for people to make their arguments, marshal their case, and appeal. And then we'll see what happens. But the continued rhetoric and action and going up to the brink on the part of the administration, I find to be deeply troubling. And so I'm higher up on that scale.
Okay. And I think it's fair to say that all of us on this call and all of us, the people we talk to, recognize that we're living in an unprecedented time. This has never happened before, and certainly in my lifetime, where this level of disrespect of challenge. It's unprecedented. In fact, just along those lines, there's a new organization called the Alliance of Chief Justices. There are 47 members who are all former state chief justices, have gotten together to say we need to do something to reverse the trend of degrading our court system, taking down our justice system, and putting our nation at risk. The Article 3 coalition, all federal district court judges who are now senior retired, coming together to say we need to do something before it is too late. That's why it's so important we're doing what we're doing today, is speaking out. We started the program to talk about silence. How important, Liz, is it not to be silent, but to take action here?
It's incredibly important. We need to share our concerns as professionals with our fellow Americans. We need to do what we can with what platforms we have not to be complicit in the corruption of our justice system. That's why I have chosen to speak out, and others have as well. But folks in the Justice Department are generally not trained to speak publicly against the leadership of the department or to share their personal views. So I think that others in the Justice Department have been somewhat slow to speak out, even those who have departed the Justice Department, and to share their concerns. And that's why it's so important that we have this gathering today, and we have other forums in which professionals can share their concerns and their views about the justice system. And I want to just weigh in on that last point that you raised about how concerned we should be. We are now realizing that our justice system really it sort of underpins so many democratic safeguards, and it relies on the president being a person who operates with the public interest front and center. We've had presidents across the political spectrum who have had a range of different views about what the public interest looks like, but we have never before had a president who has felt free to use the justice system to pursue personal agendas, personal vendettas against enemies, personal favors to friends. We rely on the president being grounded and anchored in the public interest, and we have fallen so far so quickly because we have a president who does not feel beholden to that norm. But I agree very much with Governor Christie that it's the public that gives me hope. I think we are now realizing the power that we have as individual citizens when we see things like grand juries voting not to return an indictment. It is an important reminder that we, the citizens, all have power to resist and push back and to save our democracy. And speaking up is an essential, important part of that.
Fantastic. So two things. Number one is I'm in a strange background for those of you that have watched all our other performances. My building had a power failure this morning. So fortunately I was there at 6 o'clock this morning and realized I had no power. So I'm working out of the house. And we're using two river pictures today to do the production, which is a whole lot better than we've ever done before. Thanks to them, we're able to do this show right now. We wouldn't have otherwise do it. But we also are live. So we've got some questions from folks watching. And so we've not done this before. Kathy, you've got some questions. Why don't you throw them out there?
Yeah, we're hearing from the audience a couple of questions. Should the pardon power be changed, and should rules be changed to limit the term of an appointed U.S. attorney? Governor Christie, you want to start with that?
Yeah, no, I don't think the pardon power should be changed. And two, no, look, the problems with U.S. attorneys is that this current president is nominating people who can't get confirmed. So I don't think there's a problem with length of term, and he's tried to use some other federal statutes to get around the advice and consent powers of the Senate in the Constitution. I don't think there's anything broken about the U.S. attorney terms or nominating system. It's just that the president's nominating people who the Senate simply refuses to confirm. I want to remind people, I was appointed by President Bush 43. I had two Democratic and have two Democratic United States senators in New Jersey. At the time, they were Bob Torricelli and John Corzine, and they signed off on me and voted for me to be the U.S. attorney. So things have not always been this way, and I suspect they won't always be this way. So I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, we have one more question actually, and maybe Preet and Liz, you can both address this. People want to know, what can everyday citizens, regular people, what do they need to do? Like, is there an action plan? They want to help. They want to make sure that the rule of law in this country is protected. What advice would you give people out there? Preet, want to start with you.
Sure. First, pay attention. There's an issue with the torrent of news, negative, disturbing, and it causes people to want to turn away and to tune out, and you can't do that, especially in the context of the flooding of the zone. I cover this stuff and follow this stuff both as a practicing lawyer and as a podcaster every week, and it gets overwhelming for me. But find voices that you understand and that you can appreciate, to learn what things are supposed to be and how things are supposed to unfold and what normal is. Try to persuade your neighbors and others about it. And the most important thing in all of this is voting. Vote for people at every level who believe in integrity, who believe in the impartial administration of justice, who believe in the rule of law. There was never going to be any savior in the form of a prosecutor, notwithstanding the backgrounds of the people on this Zoom and our respective egos. The saviors are the voters who decide who they put in office and understand what those people who they put in office are going to do. And nothing is solved until that is solved.
Great. And your advice was so good. Liz, I'm going to ask you one last final question from an audience, actually. And they wanted to know, basically, what would your advice be? U.S. attorneys are on the front line. The judicial branch is basically holding the line. What advice do you give to U.S. attorneys who maybe are in these questionable situations? We just heard recently Democratic senators were giving advice to members of the military that ended up being very controversial, but they were really just saying follow the law. What would you say to U.S. attorneys today?
Once you compromise your integrity, you cannot get it back. I think it's important for everyone in the Justice Department to remember that. In my case, I stood up for what I believed and it cost me my job, but I left the Justice Department with my integrity intact. And I've never questioned for 1 second that that was the right decision. So I would really urge everyone in the Justice Department who's trying under very difficult circumstances to continue to serve the public and do your jobs to take the long view and keep in mind that if you compromise your integrity, you cannot so easily regain it.
Fantastic. On that note, because that's a great note to end on, I'm optimistic that if we stick together, if we vote the way we need to vote, we follow the rule of law, which we do constitutionally. Can't thank each of you enough for joining us today. This is an important dialogue. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to do, and I'm just so indebted to the three of you for your voice out there every single day, every week. It's exhausting. There's never enough stuff. There's always more material. It's like it never gets old, unfortunately. So I want to thank you very, very much for joining us today, and have a great holiday season, everyone. Happy and healthy. Enter 2026. Governor, Preet, Liz, thank you very much, guys.